For 15 years, she made me believe she had kept all his things safe. When I opened the closet, all that was left was an empty shelf and a lie that lasted half my life. She always said she wanted to protect me from the pain. But when I found out what she'd done, I realized she only wanted to protect herself from the guilt. My dad passed away when I was 13. It wasn't sudden. He'd been sick for years, the slow kind of sickness that drains the color from someone's face and turns hospital waiting rooms into a second home. He died in the fall, when the leaves in our yard had just started turning. And for some reason, I always remembered that detail. After the funeral, my mom packed up his things. I asked where everything was going: his letters, his watch, his guitar, even the jacket he used to wear every Sunday. She said, with a soft voice and a sad smile, "They're all safe. When you're older, I'll show you. I just don't want you to carry this kind of weight right now." And honestly, that made sense to me at the time. I was 13. I was barely holding it together. The idea that his things were waiting for me, somewhere, gave me comfort. Like there would be a day when I'd be ready, and it would all come back. Years passed. I went to high school, then college. I moved out, got a job, visited on holidays. Every once in a while, I'd ask about his things. She always had the same answer: "They're safe, sweetheart. Still where I put them. You'll see them when the time is right." And I trusted her. Until a few months ago. It started when my fiancée and I got engaged. We were planning our wedding, and I told her I wanted to wear my dad's cufflinks, the ones he wore on his wedding day. I hadn't seen them in over a decade, but I just knew my mom had them stored away, probably in some labeled box with tissue paper and a note. So I called her. "Hey, Mom, do you think I could stop by this weekend and look through Dad's stuff? I'd really love to wear those cufflinks." There was a pause, a weird one. Then she said, "Oh, honey, I didn't know you still wanted that kind of thing." I didn't think much of it. Maybe she was just emotional. I brushed it off. That weekend, I drove over to her place. She'd downsized to a small condo a few years back, and she always said she had a storage closet where everything important was. I walked in, hugged her, and she pointed to the hallway. "It's all in there," she said. I opened the closet door. There were 4 shelves, a couple of holiday decorations, an old suitcase, some tax folders, but no boxes, no guitar, no watch, no letters, no cufflinks, nothing. I turned to her. "Is there another closet?" She looked at me for a second, like she was trying to decide whether to lie or not. And then, with the same calm voice she always used, she said, "I sold most of it. Years ago." My stomach dropped. "What? You were so young. I didn't think you'd want those things." I needed the space. And honestly, we needed the money. I couldn't speak. I literally could not form words. She went on like she was explaining where the cookies went. The watch went to a vintage dealer. The cufflinks, too. Some of the books I donated. The guitar. Oh, that one went quick. Some college kid bought it. He looked so happy. I sat down. I didn't remember sitting down, but there I was, on her beige love seat, staring at the carpet while she listed off my dad's legacy like items on a yard sale receipt. "I kept a few things," she said. "I think." She opened a drawer in her kitchen and pulled out a single photograph, a 4x6 of my dad holding me as a baby. That was it. That was everything. And the worst part? She didn't even seem sorry. She just kept saying, "I really thought you wouldn't care." I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything or storm out. I just sat there, holding that one photo, while she stood in the kitchen acting like this was just another casual conversation. "I really thought you wouldn't care." That sentence played on repeat in my head like a bad song I couldn't skip. I think what made it worse was how completely detached she was, like selling off everything that connected me to my father was no big deal. Just another errand she had to check off a to-do list one year. And suddenly, 1,000 things from the past started to make sense. The way she'd always brushed off conversations about my dad. How she never wanted to look at old pictures. Why she changed phone numbers and moved right after I went to college. The way she kept saying she'd tell me when the time was right, knowing full well there was nothing left to tell. She didn't keep the stuff because she didn't want the reminder. She didn't tell me because she knew I'd be devastated. And she didn't apologize because, deep down, she still didn't think she was wrong. So I left. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just stood up, said I had to go, and drove home in silence. My fiancée was waiting for me. She took one look at my face and didn't ask any questions. Just sat next to me on the couch, while I tried to explain something that didn't make sense even in my own head. She sold everything, I said. Everything. All of it. We sat there in silence for a long time. Later that night, I went looking through some old emails. Years ago, when I moved to college, I'd sent myself a bunch of random digital stuff, just backups I never deleted. Photos, old Word docs, receipts. At the time, I didn't even realize I was preserving anything. But buried in a folder labeled school junk was a scan of a letter. It was one my dad had written to me a few months before he passed, but never gave me. He'd left it on my desk one night, and I had scanned it before the ink started to fade. I'd forgotten I even had it. Reading it again at 28 felt like being punched in the chest. You won't understand everything yet, but one day you will. I hope you keep the things I leave behind, not because they're valuable, but because they were mine. And I hope you always know how much I loved you. That letter broke me, not just because of what it said, but because it reminded me that he wanted me to have his things. He wanted me to remember him. And my mom took that from me without even blinking. A few days later, she texted me, "Thinking about you. Let me know when you want to come by again." I didn't respond. The next week, she sent another message. "You're being dramatic. This isn't worth ruining our relationship." That one made my blood boil. Because if I'm being dramatic for being upset that she sold my father's legacy for gas money and shelf space, then maybe the relationship was already ruined. She just hadn't noticed yet. That weekend, I drove back to her place. Not to fight, not to reconnect, but to ask one question. She opened the door like nothing had happened. Like we were just two people catching up over coffee. I got straight to the point. "Did you even think about asking me?" She sighed. "I told you. We needed the money. And I didn't think you'd care." "That's not an answer." She crossed her arms. "What do you want me to say, Alex? That I made a mistake? Fine. I made a mistake. But it's done. You don't need those things to remember him." I stared at her. "You don't get to decide that." She didn't say anything. "He asked me to keep them. He said it in a letter. He trusted me. And you threw that trust away because you were overwhelmed." Her face shifted a little. Not guilt. Not remorse. Just discomfort. And that's when I realized. She didn't think she owed me anything. She genuinely believed she did what was best. Not for me, but for her. And for the first time in my life, I saw her clearly. I left her house that day feeling different. Not angry. Not heartbroken. Not even numb anymore. Just clear. Clear about who she was. About what I'd lost. And about the fact that the version of her I had built in my head, the protective, grieving widow who kept my father's memory safe, never really existed. She wasn't malicious. She wasn't cruel. She was just someone who didn't want to carry someone else's grief. So she got rid of it. And now I was the one left to carry what little remained. But here's the thing about grief. It changes shape, but it doesn't disappear. And the more I sat with that truth, the more I realized I had two options. I could keep replaying the loss, or I could try to reclaim something. So I started looking. First, I went through old photos, scanned them, organized them, uploaded them to the cloud. Then I started reaching out to extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. "Hey, do you have anything of Dad's?" Most of them didn't. A few sent me digital copies of photos they'd taken back in the day. One uncle sent me a box of things he'd found in his garage, random stuff, a broken harmonica, a mug from his college days, a handwritten recipe for chili. None of it was valuable, but every piece felt like something real. One cousin, who used to live nearby when we were kids, called me out of the blue. "I didn't know you were looking," she said, "but I've had this for years." She mailed me a cassette tape, a recording of my dad playing guitar at a family cookout in 1996. You can barely hear the music over the sound of people laughing, but it's his voice, right there in the background, telling a joke I'd forgotten he used to tell. I must have played it 50 times in a row. Meanwhile, I kept thinking about the things my mom sold. The watch, the guitar, the cufflinks. There was no real way to track most of it. But I figured, if she sold anything through local listings, maybe there was a trace. So I searched. Craigslist archives, Facebook Marketplace, eBay listings. I even joined a couple of vintage watch collector forums and posted descriptions. And one day, someone messaged me. A guy named Matt. He said he bought a watch from a woman in my area a few years ago. A Hamilton with an engraving on the back. RJ to AL, time is ours. That was it. That was his watch. I nearly dropped my phone when I read it. I called him immediately. Told him who I was, what the watch meant, how it had been sold without my knowledge. He was quiet for a second. then said, I don't usually sell stuff I collect, but this one's going back to you. No charge. I offered to pay. He refused. Said something about karma, about dads, about how he'd want someone to do the same for him. A week later, I had the watch in my hands. It was scratched, a little worn, but it still worked. And the engraving? Still clear as ever. I held it for a long time, not crying, not spiraling, just remembering. And that's when I made a decision. I wasn't going to keep the watch in a drawer. I was going to wear it on my wedding day, not because it matched my suit, but because it reminded me who I came from, who I still carried, who I refused to let be erased. The morning of my wedding, I put on the watch. It felt heavier than I remembered, maybe because it carried more now. Not just time, but memory. Proof. A small, solid reminder that not everything gets erased, not if you fight to keep it alive. My fiancée noticed it immediately. Is that it? I nodded. That's the one. She smiled. She didn't need to say anything else. She knew what it meant. She knew how hard I fought just to hold on to something that should have never been taken. The ceremony was small, just close friends and family. Some faces were missing. One in particular. My mom wasn't there. She was invited. We left that door open, but she never RSVP'd, never sent a message, never called. And honestly, that was okay. I had spent so long trying to understand her choices, trying to justify, excuse, or make peace with what she did, that I forgot I didn't need her approval to grieve how I needed to. This wasn't about punishment. It was about peace. And for the first time in a long time, I felt it. After the ceremony, we had a short reception. Someone made a toast. Someone cried. My best man told a story about how my dad once tried to teach us how to change a tire and ended up breaking the jack. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled champagne on my new wife. That night, back at our place, I took the watch off and placed it on the dresser. It caught the light just right. The engraving shimmered for half a second. Time is ours. I stared at it and thought, yeah, it still is. A few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a card, plain, no message on the front. Just 2 sentences inside. I was wrong. I know that now. I'm sorry. It was her handwriting. No name, no details, no explanations. But I knew. And weirdly, I didn't need more than that. Sometimes, people can't give you what you deserved when it mattered most. Sometimes they're too deep in their own pain to see what they've taken from yours. And sometimes, all that's left to do is choose whether you carry the wound or the wisdom. I chose the wisdom. I chose to rebuild. And now, every time I glance at that watch on my wrist, I don't think about what was lost anymore. I think about what I reclaimed.